Hello, I'm Paulette. Thank you for all coming here today. I'm going to start my presentation with a little story. I want to tell you a story about a little girl who I grew up with who had autism, and even though she didn't know it yet, she struggled a lot making friends in school, and she also had a hard time with learning. She struggled with anything that came in essentially through her eyes. Reading was challenging, math, and anything that came in through her ears was really easy for her. So she was actually taught in a very non-traditional way called unschooling. Unschooling was essentially a form of homeschooling, and it was self-guided, and it taught her that the world was her playground and that she could study anything she pleased or do anything she pleased or go anywhere she pleased. So she had also got a t-shirt. It said, "The world is my playground" on it. And she was very literal because she had autism. So she thought, quite literally, I can go anywhere. And she thought really big. So if you asked her what she wanted to be when she grew up, she would often answer something like President of the United States or Barbara Walters. She would have also settled for Dolly Parton. So she struggled a lot with math and reading, as I mentioned, but she also had some really great strengths. She was very musical. So she was able to listen to an album, and she could memorize an entire score and learn it by heart. And she was also super organized. Her mind was very logical and literal, and she loved planning large events. Her favorite toy was a clipboard. She often would walk around and fundraise, and she basically was given large amounts of responsibility at a very young age, and she would boss adults around, treating them as equals, calling them by their first names and giving them directions, which charmed some but deeply offended others. And she was really full of opinions, and she would often write letters to the newspaper informing the town and the mayor of how she thought things should be run. And these letters were often published, more often than not, so she really didn't understand that she was unusual. And in fact, every time she got an idea, she would run with it, and her parents and those around her learned better than to doubt her ambitious goals. When she turned 8 years old, this little girl went up to her mom and said, "Mommy, I'd like to become an opera singer." So her mother looked down at this little girl and thought, why not? So she enrolled her in music lessons, and she studied diligently and learned volumes of music by heart. And at the age of 16, while she was at a voice lesson, she saw a poster on the wall that said, "Come and sing in Rome. This is the home of opera." So she thought, okay, that's what opera singers do. So she decided she would go to Rome to sing at 16. And many people, she would say this, "I would love to go to Rome." They would say, "This is too ambitious." But for her, the limit did not exist. So she auditioned for an opera program in Rome, and she was accepted. And she was undeterred by the financial, restrictions of a flight to Europe and the tuition for the program. So she actually held a fundraiser, and she earned the money all on her own that she needed to go. And at 17, she found herself exploring Italy with the confidence of a seasoned world traveler. So I have a confession to make. That little girl was me. Chapter 1. So, as a kid, as I mentioned, I have autism, so the odds were really stacked against me. Autism wasn't yet a trend. We were very far from having something like a Dandelion or an Untapped program. When I was a kid, in fact, those diagnosed tended to be young boys. And in fact, a special ed teacher once informed me that they didn't even call them autistics. They just had a word for all kids who had learning delays or different kinds of abilities. Whether it was an intellectual disability or not, she just called them FKs. Everyone called them FKs, funny kids. So that gives you a sense of the culture in where I was raised and where many of us were raised if we were born in the 80s. I was also one of 8 children, so I was the oldest, and my parents worked incredibly hard to keep our family going. We all worked together. In fact, my father had a construction company and then proceeded to have 7 girls, and he taught us all how to wield a hammer. And I really credit a lot of my work ethic to spending, hours working with him. As a teenager and a young adult, I really enjoyed doing construction work, and it taught me a lot of project management skills, and probably more than I could ever learn in a classroom, realistically. However, college was not something that was on my radar. I didn't go to a traditional school. A lot of the kids around me were attending, but I wasn't exactly sure of the path for me. I was a singer. I wasn't really great at math. And typically, you need a certain level of education, especially for somebody with my level of drive and ambition. I don't know how many presidents there have been who didn't necessarily have a certain caliber of education. So I actually never received a high school diploma, nor did I go to college. So when I was in my 20s, I had a friend who was also a musician, and she said, you can actually study music at college. And I thought to myself, well, might be worth it. I was intelligent. I was musically gifted. My mom was also an opera singer. Really gifted singers run in my family. So I reasoned I could give it a try. But I had a learning disability. I knew this. I didn't have a diagnosis, but I struggled. And it meant that also I couldn't read music fluently. So while I could listen to it, I struggled a lot with learning music by rote. Or rather, no, by rote is by ear. Learning music more traditionally, rather. So I enrolled in a local university. I was accepted, and I got a full scholarship because I sang quite well in the audition. And so I told this professor there that I wanted to be a singer and possibly a composer. I like to write music. And he said simply, no, that's not possible. You can't read music. Don't get your hopes up. So I decided I didn't want to accept that perspective. So I went off to New York City because I heard that's where you go when you want to make it. And in fact, my mother was from New York, so I had a lot of family there. And I went and I auditioned for the Manhattan School of Music because I knew this was a great school and I wanted to study music. I was, in fact, accepted, which was a huge deal. And I was really thrilled, ready to go, until I saw the tuition bill. And in fact, I was undeterred because, I'd raised money before, $50,000 a year. I figured it was a lot, but maybe I could make that happen. So I did what any logical young woman in need of funds would do. I turned to the Miss America pageant. It sounds a little funny, but in fact, this pageant happened to fall on my birthday every year. And I was quite a nerdy little girl, and I didn't have the same kind of social graces as the girls around me. And I used to watch this pageant, and I used to dream of being transformed from this ugly little duckling into this beautiful, poised woman. The crown wasn't bad either. And because I didn't see limits, I really reasoned I had as good a chance of winning as any. And really, I knew I could sing and I could speak intelligently. So I entered a local pageant and I became a runner-up. And I won a talent award. So that meant money. I got $500. Not a whole lot, not a huge drop in the bucket, but it was something. And I realized that I had maybe what it took. So I went for the big one, the Miss Cleveland pageant in Ohio. That's a big deal. A lot of the Miss Ohios who go on to Miss America come from this pageant. And I entered, and I, in fact, did quite well. And I in fact, won the pageant. And I basically surveyed these girls, and I said, my logical mind was thinking that I could concoct a reasonable facsimile of their method of mode and dress. So all I needed was a platform, a social platform, a swimsuit, and a solid talent routine. So I went for it and I won. I won both the talent and the interview awards. And in fact, I was crowned Miss Cleveland, and I found myself on the way to Miss Ohio. So now I've got this crown on my head, but not much else of a clue what to do. And I was competing at the state level now against girls who'd been in the pageant system for years. And so I knew I needed to do well in order to be eligible for the bigger scholarships. And also, I was about to age out, which meant that I was going to hit the age limit of 24. So in pageant years, this is very old. I knew I would not be permitted to compete the following year. And so I really honed my interview skills. In fact, I went to interview at a local radio station, and I did so well that I was hired on the spot, which was a small-scale fulfillment of my dream to become Barbara Walters. Now, because I was competing at the state level, I was being constantly scrutinized by pageant officials who were very critical and had a lot of influence over who would make it into the top 10, et cetera. And so one of these pageant officials, I remember he met with myself and my parents one night, and he talked to me, and after it was over, he cornered me and he said, you know, your eye contact is not good. It makes you appear untrustworthy. I really don't think that you're going to be successful in this pageant because we don't trust you. And in fact, he said it was highly unlikely that I would win, essentially. And people with autism, in fact, do not enjoy eye contact. And ironically, we are also terrible liars. So I refused to take no for an answer. I summoned my courage, and I stared directly into his eyes, and I approached the pageant preparation with a level of determination that only an autistic could muster. And in fact, the limit did not exist. I knew that if I made a strong showing at Miss Ohio, that I'd be eligible for much larger scholarships. In fact, the Miss America system is the biggest provider of scholarships for young women in America, which is both sad and, you know, a no-brainer for me if I'm looking for large sums of money. In fact, it doesn't even provide that much. In fact, a large number of the dollars that they count, the winner of Miss America actually gets a number of free rides, and they're counting all of those dollars, even though she can only use one of them. So it's a great source of some revenue, but we could do a lot better for our young women in America. So because, you know, pageants, they dictated things like thin equals beautiful, and I was much too young to question these things. I used to run every day. I used to wrap myself in saran wrap and run in the winter, in the snow, and I'd read this did something to body fat. I still am not entirely sure what, but it worked. I got quite thin, and I actually grew out my little bob into, or I had a pixie haircut. I grew it into a little bob, and I waved to the crowds during the Miss Ohio parade like a pro from the back of a silver Cadillac convertible. So this pageant week, it was a blur of activity, and the highlight for me was essentially winning the preliminary talent contest. So they split us into 3 groups. We each have a talent flight where we compete against one another, and I won my group, and I sang Carmen's Habanera, which is an aria about a devious young woman who sings, "If you love me, beware."
L'amour
you very much. Thank you. Needless to say, none of the other girls could do that. So, as I mentioned, that won me the Preliminary Talent Award. And in fact, there was a lot of buzz around the Preliminary Talent Award winners because they were the most likely to become the top 10 finalists. So when the pageant week came to an end, we spent an entire week going and competing in these different rounds. I was waiting on stage with the other finalists to see who would be announced as the top 10 who'd go on to compete for the crown. So they started to read the names one by one, and they read 7, 8, they came to 9. My heart was in my throat, and then it sank rapidly. My name wasn't called, and I wasn't going to become Miss Ohio after all. You know, I felt like I'd failed my family and my 6 younger sisters. They'd helped me prepare for so many months. I had failed as a woman. Just kidding. But, you know, I knew the ramifications of not winning probably meant that Manhattan School of Music might be out of the picture. And I retreated to my little dressing table just to process, and I was eventually called back onto the stage to perform in the final number with all of the finalists, and we were going to stand and listen to the announcement of the winners. So that's when it happened. I heard my name, and it turned out I'd won a prize. It was a non-finalist talent award, and, well, it was better than nothing. Again, I went up on stage, I retrieved my prize, I heard my family cheering and my friends, and it was a $500 scholarship. It was better than nothing. So I walked back to my place on stage, and then I heard my name called again, and again, and again, and then again. You get the picture. Each time, the audience really began to laugh, and then every time my name was announced, their laughter grew. And it turned out I had won every possible non-finalist talent award. Actually, it happened there were quite a few. I won everything from the Classical Vocal Performance Award to something called the Betty Estep Memorial Outstanding Classical Performance Award. And these were intended to be distributed amongst the 40-some-odd contestants. So it was kind of comical. And I also received the Miss America Award for community service that night for my work at AIDS hospices across the country. And after the crown itself, the Marvin Hamlish, remember that name for later, Grand Talent Award was the most coveted prize of the evening. So it was historically granted to a top finalist, often somebody very close to the top, because of the number of points associated with it. And I listened with the rest of the finalists curiously to see which one of those top 10 finalists would be the winner. And I heard my name called once again. The crowd burst into applause, and it turned out I had won the grand talent of overall all of the girls, including the top 10 finalists. So it seemed like this little girl from Cleveland had turned the tables once again. And in fact, I went home with so many unique awards that, with the exception of Miss Ohio herself, I had won the most prize money of any contestant that evening. So, thank you. So this is Chapter 3, Princess of Wales. So I did not earn enough to attend Manhattan School of Music. In fact, I would have had to go on to the Miss America pageant and then, you know, have won the entire thing against the entire country. So what it did allow me to do, Mr. Hamlish's Grand Talent Award and many of these other awards gave me enough money to go back to Europe. So I enrolled in the International Lyric Academy in Rome, which was a non-degree program, but very respectable. Gave me some more feathers in my cap and a little bit more vocal training. And I was invited to do my first main stage role as Maddalena in Verdi's Rigoletto. And that was at the New Opera Festival di Roma. And while I was there during this whole process, I learned about this program that one of my benefactors had sent their daughter to, and it was a postgraduate opera program in Wales. This school was called the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama, and it had a really good reputation. and they had a wonderful vocal program. Most importantly, it was affordable. Still remains affordable to this day, inexplicably. It's a wonderful program. The only issue was that it was a graduate program. And I was told essentially that I would not be accepted without a high school diploma, which is essentially college here, or a bachelor's degree. So I did a little digging, and for me, I decided this limit should not exist, and I refused to take no for an answer. So I utilized my powers of persuasion, and I cited a clause in their application materials which said a bachelor's degree or its equivalent in study. So I turned their no into a yes, and I was admitted to this university on the basis of equivalency as a graduate student. So, in other words, I could really sing. And again, that limit did not exist. So I spent a year or some odd time in Europe, and this gave me a practical launch pad into the world of opera. Up until this point, the best professional advice I'd gotten was that I needed to sing for Placido Domingo. Rest assured then my career would be set. Unfortunately, Placido was not that easy to track down, so I graduated with my postgraduate diploma in opera, and I sang professionally throughout Europe and the US for a while, and I was eventually sort of surprised when I was tapped by this university called the University of Cincinnati, who had this conservatory of music that was world-renowned, Cincinnati Conservatory of Music, and they had a program called an artist diploma, which is a really big honor, and it's a legendary conservatory, and the artist diploma is something that only people like Joshua Bell or Renee Fleming ever receive. It's just folks who are kind of at the pinnacle of their studies and maybe their careers, and it was really kind of a big deal. And I found myself invited to this program at this legendary conservatory, which was second only to Juilliard, and I found myself singing with some of the most talented students in the world. In addition to that, I really relished being, for the first time, in a really world-class academic environment, because I'd only really been to conservatories, and at this point I'm at a school that has a wonderful engineering program and a medical school, etc. And once again, my ambition got the better of me. I dove in headfirst, and I saw an advertisement for graduate student government president. I applied for this, and I was elected. And I found myself, performing and also managing 41 graduate student associations and a 6-figure budget. This was a lot, but then again, I wanted to be president of the United States, so I figured this is good practice. Yeah. So the executive vice president of the university, I sat on the president's cabinet and the board of trustees, et cetera, or I represented the graduate population with the board of trustees. The executive vice president took an interest in this unusual girl from Cleveland, and she offered to mentor me over the course of the next 2 years. She encouraged me to explore my intellectual gifts, and in fact, she was really the first executive female administrator I'd ever met. So that really opened up my eyes to options of what I could be. Seeing myself in another person reflected back at me. It was often just she and I in a room of maybe like 10 or 15 males, and she would often point that out. And she would say, look around the room, it's Paulette and I, this needs to change. And she was very inspirational to me. And in fact, a number of my GSA officers were from the different colleges, and they studied computer science, and I was really fascinated by it. I thought of them as the smartest people I'd ever met. I didn't think I'd ever quite understand what it was that they did, but I wanted to learn more. So I attended their poster sessions, their classes, and in fact, I used to memorize things like C++ and Java, just to freak them out. And in 2012, I essentially graduated from the second best conservatory in the world, and I wondered, what could I possibly do next? So I went to Juilliard. Juilliard essentially invited me to do a postgraduate internship program, and what I actually did there was I was effectively doing special events, special projects in development, and I was a program manager for the release of Juilliard's e-learning, which is a software program that they developed, an online platform that essentially teaches homeschool kids music which really hit close to home for me. And so I spent a lot of time, working with engineers and exploring my new interest in technology. And in fact, while I was there, if you recall Marvin Hamlisch, the famous Broadway composer and producer, he passed away. And in fact, I was tapped as one of the individuals responsible for organizing his memorial service. So it was really pretty incredible place to hone my organizational skills, and perhaps unsurprisingly, a very good place to explore my music. Juilliard literally gave me a backstage pass to the Metropolitan Opera. It was directly across the street, and I would often go there to listen to rehearsals at any time. And in fact, one of the board members, after an event, he approached me and he said, "I'd like you to come, and I want you to do a private audience and sing for Placido Domingo at the Met Opera." So finally caught up with him. I was so nervous. That's Placido and I up in the right corner. That's him down there, as I knew him as a child. Placido Flamingo, he loves the telephone. That was one of my favorite skits from Sesame Street. I'm not sure if you guys had that out here. Yeah, it's fantastic. That's actually how a lot of kids get introduced to classical music in the 70s, 80s, et cetera. And so I essentially went into this room and I performed, and he said, I want you to know this is a very special occasion. He said, in fact, this is the first room I ever sang in at the Met. And he said, this is a special moment. And he's like, I predict really good things for you, and I think you're going to be on the main stage soon. And after I performed, it was pretty incredible because he was really visibly moved. And in fact, he had been one of my grandfather's favorite singers for so many years. And it just felt like everything was coming together. And to see him be moved by me, I remember my grandfather would come to my performances when I was 5, and he would be shouting, "Bravo, prima donna," like a little 8-year-old girl. It was pretty incredible. And I sort of wished he could have been there to meet him. He was such a big opera fan. So it was really surreal to see our operatic idol visibly moved by something that I performed. So that was really one of the pinnacles of my artistic experience. So unfortunately, Placido did not single-handedly make my career, as many had postulated, but he really helped the Met feel more like a part of my global playground. The world is getting smaller and smaller now. And he indeed asked me to work free of charge with his personal coach, who's also the coach to Andrea Bocelli. And I worked with him for many years while I lived in New York. No fee associated with that, which was nice. And in fact, they actually came out to Google pretty recently. Andrea Bocelli did a concert, and my coach was there, and they had me come out to his concert in San Jose, which was really fun. So again, it's a very small world. And working at Juilliard and living in New York was wonderful. It was very exciting. I worked with really cool people like Daniel Day-Lewis, Catherine Zeta-Jones. I was planning these huge, lavish red carpet events. But in fact, there was another side to living in New York, which was really challenging. One, I love living there, but if you're a person with autism, sometimes it's very challenging to be around the overstimulation. I think even this couldn't handle the vision of New York. It was very loud. It was very expensive. It was very challenging for me to get enough to eat, to be able to pay rent, and I struggled a lot. And I'm leaving this up intentionally long so you can feel a little uncomfortable. For those of you with autism, feel free to look away, avert your eyes. But I had to actually get special earplugs designed to even be able to use the subway because it was so loud and overstimulating. And to experience food insecurity and financial poverty, essentially, and lack of health insurance, while surrounded by so much luxury. At the Met Opera, I had billionaire friends, and I was an opera singer, so I'd often be at these galas with all this lavish food, and I'd be taking some home for me to eat for lunch the next day. And I realized there's something funny about this, The privilege wasn't distributed as evenly as one would think, and even though I had an equal education to some of the people I was working with who had great wealth, the opera doesn't pay as well as you might think. So I really had to think a little bit. I learned some strategic planning skills in my business classes at Cincinnati Conservatory, And I started to think, what if I applied those to my life? So I started to look at my core values. And amidst this cacophony of noise and sounds and sights, and I basically said to myself, I value my family, I value well-being and health. I need to eat more, I need to exercise. You know, there are certain things that I need. I want to support my family. And so I decided that I was going to get a job, my first real job. And I applied for this place called YAI, National Institute for People with Disability. And it moved me from essentially this to this. I was able to basically get an apartment for myself. This was directly across the street from the National Institute for People with Disabilities. I was essentially I did special events. I was an assistant manager of special events. And I would walk 1 block to work every day. And I lived in this beautiful apartment called the Webster Apartment for Young Ladies. And it was all women. We all had a little room. We shared baths. And then we had 3 meals a day, which was fantastic because sometimes people living with autism also struggle with executive functioning. So the free food was a really big deal to me. Being able to know, okay, now it's time to eat, you know, and it was a really good social environment. We also had 3 walled gardens in the backyard. We had a library, and this was actually built for the women who worked at the Macy's department store in the 1920s because there was nowhere for them to live that was safe. And no boys are allowed upstairs. It was very old school, very much like the Barbizon where Grace Kelly used to live. These are very famous, like New York storied landmarks. So I used to sing regularly. I loved living in this space. It was very calming. That was my princess pad, I called it. I designed it all myself. And that was me just hanging out at home, you know, as one does in the lobby there. And so now I sat on the New York City Mayor's Council for People with Disabilities, which I absolutely loved. And I was leading these multi-million-dollar nonprofit fundraisers and star-studded galas, very similar to what I did at Juilliard. And I also helped to found a women's autism program called Felicity House. And while I loved living in New York, I also found myself at a crossroads. I had a job, you know, I was a great singer, things were going quite well, I had enough in the bank, but something was missing. I wanted to use my brain more. So I really began to think back to what I'd learned at the University of Cincinnati, you know, observing those engineers, and I still had this nagging feeling that there was something missing, so I began to teach myself to code. And I would attend these local hacker events, New York City Maker Faire, and I also received my first really official diagnosis of autism. I received some provisional diagnoses going in to say, I think I have a learning disability, and they would look at my profile and say, wow, you're in the 99th percentile here and the 2nd percentile here. That's a very unusual profile. Perhaps consider it might be autism. And the more I learned about autism through my work at the National Institute for People with Disabilities, working with people with autism, I started to recognize some of those qualities in myself. And so it helped me get a sense of the way my mind worked. And in fact, I did have dyscalculia, which accounted for why it was so challenging for me to process what I saw. It's very severe, in fact. And in fact, probably the most important aspect of the diagnosis was I found out that rather than being, maybe like intellectually challenged or stupid, which is probably how I always felt because I couldn't do what other kids could do even as a child, reading music or books fluently. It turned out I had a genius level IQ. Turned out I was quantitatively very gifted. And these were some pretty rigorous tests that they put me through, so I really couldn't refute this. And I realized, maybe I just need a new way to learn. So I harnessed that, and this information really gave me the tools I needed to complete my education. So I gave it some thought, and I went through the process of applying and receiving my GED, the state of New York. So this is my high school equivalency. And I decided I was going to apply for college. So I had seen Legally Blonde, so I knew that non-traditional students could be accepted into the Ivy Leagues. So I applied for my local Ivy League, which was Columbia University. Columbia wrote back and they said no. They said, we really don't think that it's not personal, but you've never taken a quantitative course in your life, and we have this quantitative requirement. And they essentially said they thought I would not be able to pass the base quantitative requirement, i.e. I would never graduate. I'd just be there interminably. So I didn't agree with them. I wrote back. I respectfully disagreed, and I argued that that limit did not exist. And I was confident that my passion, my grit, and my determination would be enough. They relented, and I was ecstatic. This is my acceptance letter. That's me being profiled in one of our Columbia student journals. And as it turned out, their limit did not exist. I was accepted to the university. First thing I did, I immediately signed up for a computer science class. It was called 1004. And it was Intro to Computer Science, which I thought was going to be easy. But in fact, it was very hardcore, like a lot of programming in Java, very steep learning curve. You had to be incredibly fluent in certain kinds of maths in order to succeed. And right away, I knew I was in over my head. So and I wanted to get it out of the way, because then as long as I could pass a quantitative requirement, I knew I'd be good. So I had both this ambition to do computer science, but also this kind of desperate hope, I just need to get one out of the way so that I can at least relax and know that I can graduate. So I started to go to these office hours. I joined the Women in Computer Science group. And it was really amazing, because I would sit with other girls, some of whom had learning disabilities, and they were all struggling. And they told us, don't expect to get a 4.0. I'd gotten a 4.0 in my other 2 degrees, and I thought, I've got to do this here. And I went in for the midterm, and they're like, just do your best. And I came out with an F. I failed it miserably. And the teacher looked at me, and he's like, you sit in the front every single class. Nobody else even comes to class. You record everything. I can tell you're engaged, you're smart, you can do this. And he's like, I'm wiping this grade, and I'm going to give you your grade for the final, for the class. And he worked with me. He was a champion, and he said, I'm going to help you learn. And he gave me, the resources I needed. I worked with the disability services. I got this live scribe pen that I would take to class. My boyfriend would even help me study, my friends that I'd met, and I studied all the time. And I went into the final. And the first experience was very similar to all my other test-taking endeavors, where I would be just kind of panicked and I would randomly fill in boxes. But for this final test, I sat down, I looked at the paper, and I looked up at the TA who was proctoring my test, and I was like, I know this. I understand. And she was like, good. And I was like, I know this too. I know this too. And I filled out this entire test all by myself. And I came out of that test just sort of astounded, and I had this new realization that I was actually pretty smart. I could do things. And I understood how the computer worked. I remember the first time I built in a working for loop for, even Hello World was a big deal. Just making a computer do something was so exciting. And my teacher, he had this kind of funny look on his face when he gave me back my grade, and I got an A letter grade in my first quantitative course, ultimately. No pressure. So I did quite well, and I loved it. I'm not going to say it was easy. And I wound up taking other, data structures, and I also did quite well in that course. And I took the base level courses for computer science, and I also went to Grace Hopper, which is the big conference for women in computing. I think this year they had something like 25,000 people attend. And it's a phenomenal event if you ever have a chance to go. Also be a good place for recruiting, I would say. And I served on the board of the Columbia Women in Computer Science. I was the corporate chair. So my job was to liaise with some excellent companies, tech companies, banks, et cetera, folks who were looking to recruit women with autism, or autistic women, and this helped me to develop excellent relationships with companies, including Google. So they're looking to recruit not only women, but a diverse spectrum of women from different backgrounds and racial profiles, et cetera. So it was pretty amazing to work with these D&I groups. One thing that happened to me, which was very exciting, I was offered in my sophomore year something called the Google Lime Scholarship. So these Google Scholars, it's a program for people of color, women, non-traditional students of all persuasions, and that included disabilities, also veterans. It was a great program, and they flew me out to Mountain View, and in fact, they basically sponsored a year of my education, and they had panels and hackathons and really helped us to increase our confidence as technologists. We worked on coding, and we learned different languages. It was really fun. And in fact, Google was one of those places that I'd always sort of idolized and thought maybe one day. I used to walk around the building in New York and just kind of peek up, hope somebody would just like leave a door open. I would just dream about the culture and the possibilities, most importantly, the free food. And I reasoned if I worked at Google, I would never be hungry again. So at the end of my sophomore year, after having become a Google Lime Scholar, I had learned about the role of not only the engineer, but also the program managers or the technical program managers, the folks that basically turn the crank on the software engineering process. And so I got it into my head that this was something that sounded really interesting to me. And I returned to Columbia full of hope and optimism about my future. And it seemed like all my dreams were really coming true at once. I'd been to Google, I had the opportunity to study at Columbia. I'd sung for Placido, and I was walking to work one day. I had to work full-time in order to pay for this school. And I ran right into my idol, Barbara Walters, outside the School of Journalism. So it was a very surreal moment. And sadly, like Placido, she did not immediately offer me a job. So I continued to work full-time at Columbia in order to get that free tuition. And it was really challenging, because now I'm balancing full-time work, doing faculty foundation fundraising with my computer science coursework, which, like any given class, it's like 20 hours a week of homework. It's not an insubstantial amount of time commitment. And so I had this mentor. I'd done this autism program, similar to what you guys do here. It was actually through Integrate. You actually have a book by Marcia Fieldhouse, I think, in your bags. And they basically brought me into these companies like banks, engineering firms, and they introduced us, and they said, this is what the corporate world looks like. And we had one day to chat with them, see what they did. And this fellow who was a VP of engineering at Cisco, who has since moved on to even more exalted ground in other companies, he had a daughter, a little redheaded daughter with autism also. And he was like, I'm very interested in your trajectory, let's talk. And he mentored me, and I also mentored his daughter. And he was a great guy. He said, I don't have a bachelor's degree, in fact, and he's a VP in engineering. And he encouraged me to consider alternatives to, I thought I had to go to Columbia because that's the best school or something. It's one of the better schools in the US, at least. And he said, well, why not, apply for Google now? You're struggling just to make ends meet. If you got a job at Google, you'd have a lot more resources, and you could study online, apply to this school. He suggested Empire State College. So I thought about it. And I knew that Google only accepted 0.5% of applicants. So of course I went for it. And I applied, and that's me. My first day of Google, I was accepted, and in fact, I transferred to online courses. I relocated to California, and I worked really hard to achieve my dreams. And now I'm a program manager in corporate engineering, and I just finished my bachelor's degree 1 month ago. So now I lead Autistic Women at Google. I founded this group because I thought we needed it. Every time I would hang out with the Autistics group, it was like a sea of male faces and myself and a few select other women. But we've now grown to roughly 60 members in just a short period of time. And we work really hard to help to make people feel comfortable. So it's a private group you can join. You don't have to necessarily identify externally. I'm also very engaged in our Disability Alliance, and we serve many, many, many Googlers and our subgroups. We have a number of subgroups that include everything from neurodiversity, mental health, ADHD, There's parents of kids with disabilities, mobility, like it just, the list goes on. And I use my experiences now. It's a little bit of a test case. Can somebody without a high school diploma make it all the way to Google? And I did. So I try to make employment in tech possible for other people with disabilities, especially if you don't really know those secret tribal knowledge codes that get you in the door, or you didn't go to the specific school or what have you. And in fact, as a little girl, I felt really awkward. And I had this brain that didn't fit my tiny body. And my education and my funds were somewhat limited. But my hope, my family support, my ambitions, these were all unlimited. And so I'm probably the only person in the room, I'm guessing, who didn't graduate from high school until I was in my 30s, or in their 30s rather. And I even though it took me this long to get my bachelor's degree, I also have those 2 graduate degrees in opera, and I studied computer science at Columbia. And I think this goes to show that, we are all very different, and there's really no one path to Google. Today, I'm an opera singer and program manager at Google, and I'm also a leader in this disability space. And, I've just, as I mentioned, finished my bachelor's degree, and I was invited to come to Stanford to do a master's. So I'm doing what I love, and I'm still singing. In fact, I'm studying at San Francisco Conservatory with Suzanne Menser, who's a world-renowned mezzo-soprano. I sang a lead role at San Jose Opera. And in fact, a Googler colleague of mine who taught me to do public speaking, he in fact wanted to learn to sing. So we've traded some skills, and we made this album together that got nominated for 6 Grammys last year. So it was pretty incredible to have the chance. It was very generous of him to allow me to sing on this album. So I'm still waiting for the chance to sing at the Met. You always have to have goals. But I suspect it will happen soon, perhaps maybe before I launch my presidential campaign in 2020. So the world is still my playground. It's just a little bit smaller now. Now I include Australia, which, by the way, I Googled. This is the farthest you can get from my hometown of Cleveland, Ohio, which means I've made it pretty far. I love working for a company that shares my belief in moonshots. Truly, these limitations, they're only in the mind, and the mind itself is infinite. Truly, the limit does not exist. So, when you walk through a storm, hold your head up high, and don't be afraid of the dark. At the end of the storm is a golden sky, and the sweet silver song of our lark. Walk on through the wind, walk on through so much. Thank you. So I believe we have about 5 minutes for questions. If anybody's curious. Yes, sir.
Thanks for that.
You're welcome. Thank you for listening.
That's okay. Hello.
Hello.
I really love that you mentioned food as a primary motivator. That I really resonate with that.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's important, you know?
It's very important.
When you're not getting paid, it's hard to find.
So what I took from your story is that the limit does not exist, and you attributed a lot of your success to your own passion, grit, and determination, which you're obviously very, very blessed with and gifted with. What can other people do, and what have other people done in your life to help you with that success? Because not everyone is as gifted as you, especially with that determination. So what can other people do to help help people?
Well, I would argue that everyone is as gifted, just in different ways. That being said, I have this little slide here of what motivated me and what was very helpful. Hold on just a moment and be patient with this technology. But essentially, I did a lot of strategic planning. So I started out and I looked at my core values and I looked at my needs. Obviously, I've put these in order of priority, the most important being at the bottom. I'm just kidding. But realistically speaking, the people that were very helpful, I call them like a board of directors. So individuals like my mentors, folks who helped me along the way, my parents, my family, my sisters are a huge support. These are folks that I know I can trust and that I can lean on. And I have now got a very extensive professional network that I'm able to essentially leverage when I help colleagues and friends who are also job seekers or developing out my own kinds of programs where I do support people. So this is kind of what that looks like. Actually, one of the most common questions I get is, when do you sleep? So I actually developed this slide for that purpose because I want people to know that it's really very, very critical to do self-care first. So anything from, getting a great therapist to working with a nutritionist or, getting your body in good physical shape. All these things are critical because if you don't have that, if you don't have enough to eat, for example, you need, a certain kind of level of nutrition. These are things I think folks take for granted when they, have access to resources, or they, live at home or what have you. When you're trying to make it on your own, building up that foundation is very important. And so I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, okay, that's okay.
Yeah, okay. Any other questions? Yes. Right. Yeah, it's interesting because you can create structure within structure. So having traveled a lot, I have a very comprehensive travel list of everything I bring with me, things that make me feel like I'm at home when I'm somewhere else. I've got a suitcase, I've got all these organizational pods within it. That helps. Even change at work. You can even learn to make change routine. So I know exactly how I'm going to feel and what to expect when things change. If I have to learn a new opera role or something shifts at work and I take on a new project, I'm a program manager now, so I have spreadsheets that I use to track a lot of this. And in fact, I share some of my more personal spreadsheets with folks if they want to learn some strategies around how to achieve goals. Because achievement doesn't happen by accident. Nothing I've done is really out of the realm of possibility for anyone in this room. Perhaps you might not be able to sing that loud, or like I might be able to teach you. If there are things that you personally value and things that you'd like to do at some point, or relationships you'd like to improve, or values that you'd like to bring to the surface, it's always absolutely possible. To more or less degrees of where do we live in the world and what access to resources do we have, obviously. Some people are more privileged than others. And I've been very lucky, I will admit. I don't even want to say lucky. I've worked very hard, and I've encountered some wonderful champions along the way. So I always try to be that champion when I meet folks. And it seems very clear to me that you guys do the exact same thing. Folks who ask for help, I always offer it. And often you can't help people unless they're ready to help themselves. So, for me, it was a lot about becoming ready to be independent and say, this is what I want to do. and I'd like to get there. And I had to do it by myself. And even being a female, having the level of, success or income that I have, just, autism aside, that's a really quite an empowering thing to have. I don't need a man. There are so many social norms that, it's easy to fall into this trap of technologies for boys. Something is maybe sounds silly, but I purchased a KitchenAid mixer for myself, and I had this funny notion that I wouldn't be allowed to have one until I got married. I grew up in the Midwest of Ohio, and it was just a lot more, there was more domestic expectations. So I bought myself this mixer. And that was a big deal. It has nothing to do with autism, but it's pushing myself outside the boundaries of what I expected for myself in my life. So yeah, change can be, to an extent, operationalized in a way that you can know that this is going to happen and that's going to happen. My good friend Andrew from Untapped did such a good job of basically mapping out what this week would look like. And I knew exactly what to expect, and I feel like I'm just sort of sailing through it. I'm all the way around the world, but I feel like I'm at home. So it's definitely possible. And if you want any actual tips, let me know, because I can share what I do. Yes?
So basically it falls into two groups. You've got your optimists, and I pick you as one of those, and those who aren't actually neurologically that way inclined.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're aiming at something like being president,
Mm-hmm.
or some other lesser
Yeah.
goals, glass full people who
Mhm.
always see possibility.
Right.
Because a lot of people with autism are not necessarily that way inclined, but they've got lots of skills.
Right.
And it's very easy to give up, I think.
No, I agree with that. It can be very, very challenging to go through life with different abilities. I was very discouraged not to be able to read music. It was really limiting. And in fact, I am no longer a full-time singer. So, there's something there. I found it easier to get a job at Google than to be a singer. That's not something most singers can say. But, perfectionism kills, ultimately. It's a very dangerous path to go down. There's no way to be perfect. I really give myself a wide berth. I underschedule a lot. I allow myself to make mistakes, and I think that was a really important thing to learn. I'm trying to think of, how to distill your question down into a more manageable, bite-sized bit of advice. But it's really about just loving ourselves and being, when we talk about glass half full, it's really about the growth mindset versus this sort of limited mindset. And that is not limited to autism. If you Google growth mindset, it's kind of a coaching concept. We talk a lot about that in executive coaching or coaching in general. There's just two ways to look at the world. And one is where we say, I'm not good enough, nothing I ever do will be good enough, etc. And you can choose which one you want to engage in. And then also it's important to consider, mental health is another very important consideration, and brain chemicals. I'm a research assistant at Stanford's neuroscience department, and I'm learning a lot about the brain structure, and especially around autism, how it functions. And if you don't have enough serotonin in your brain, or the cortisol levels are going up too high, your brain can actually influence you to think negatively. So it's also not only like an action of, I'm going to be a positive thinker. I'm not naturally a positive thinker. I just happen to have a chemical composition that I've carefully cultivated through exercise, medicine, whatever it is, to get me to a point where I feel balanced and my brain is able to just naturally reason. You can also mechanically do it. You can say, I know my brain is telling me to be negative right now, and I know that's not true, and you can override that. But it's not an optimal state for the long term. So it's really looking at health and well-being first and foremost, because if you can't actually think naturally positive thoughts, you probably need to find an excellent doctor who can work with you, or maybe do some more cardio, or there are various things you can do to influence the chemical composition of your brain. That's the short version of what I'm trying to say. Anyways, any other questions or thoughts? Are we good on time?
I'm sure there's abundance of questions out there, isn't there?
Approach me later. Yeah.
Perhaps we can, you can grab Paulette over the morning tea break or the lunch break.
And there's my email.
Please join me in thanking Paulette for a wonderfully inspiring and encouraging presentation for us this morning.
Oh, thank you.